Rowell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me on today's City and State TV is Sukanya Paciorek. She's the co-chair of the Real Estate Board of New York's Sustainability Committee and the Vice President of Corporate Sustainability for Vornado. Thank you for joining us today, Sukanya.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the real estate industry is doing around climate change, and this is kind of ahead of the UN summit that's forthcoming. So I guess what I wanted to get a sense from you is why now? Why is now the right time for the real estate industry to really be ramping up their efforts around climate change? What's driving this push for sustainability?
Well, I'd say actually that the real estate community has really been working on environmental and sustainability issues for over a decade. I think that the leaders in the real estate community also happen to be leaders in the environmental community in New York. And what we've seen over the last 10 years are kind of number of drivers moving everybody in this direction. It's one of the areas where business and environment are actually fully aligned, that this is actually really good for not just net operating income and efficiencies in buildings, and it's really best class operations, but it's also something that tenants have been pushing for over the last few years. So big tenants that want to come to New York, they want to be in a green building, they want to be in a sustainable building, they want to be in a healthy building. And all of those things, I think, over the last few years has really moved the industry to pay closer and closer attention to issues around efficiency and sustainability and well building in a comprehensive way. Other drivers that are happening in the industry right now, for those companies that are publicly traded, there's a lot of shareholder interest on these issues, kind of global interest on climate change that's kind of percolating down to companies, and we hear it from tenants, we hear it from our shareholders. And within kind of the New York community, there's really been a confluence of events that the city, the state are aligned, the community is aligned, that these issues are now important in terms of how we operate our buildings and how we develop new buildings.
Sure. Now, can you, I guess, give me a sense of, I mean, is this kind of, what's happening specifically with the buildings that are kind of retrofitting them for sustainability? Is it across the board, commercial and residential, new buildings and old buildings? Can you just give me kind of paint the picture of what's going on there?
Sure. Well, let's answer that in two parts, because I think the biggest difference in that answer is whether it's a new construction or whether it's an existing building. We'll start with new construction. New construction tends to be, and I don't want to say easier, but there's a pathway to get to a green building with a new construction. You're starting from scratch, so you can build in all the things that you want. You can build in great data systems and great energy management systems. You can put in fancy things like cogeneration and on-site generation. So new construction, I feel like over the last 10 years, we've figured out how to do very well as an industry. And the vast majority of new construction that's coming to the market today, whether it's residential or commercial, is LEED certified. So it's green construction standards, efficient construction standards, and you see that all over the city. I think there are very, very few projects that aren't coming on that are green buildings, because that's what the market is driving for, and that's what the market wants. Existing buildings, on the other hand, are much more challenging because the infrastructure is already built. So you're actually trying to retrofit something that is, in some cases in New York, 100 years old, and trying to make that a 21st century building. And there are real challenges there, both in terms of occupancy. You're trying to work around tenants who are in the building. You're trying to work around old infrastructure that's in the buildings. But I think the industry has gotten very good at dealing with those issues and is getting better at dealing with those issues. A couple of things have happened. I think we've figured out how and what types of data systems we need so that we know that this work is happening, so that we can monitor and verify that projects work, and that has come a long way in the last few years. In terms of the efficiency projects, I think LED lighting has come a long way in the last few years. So you see that kind of becoming the baseline for what people are retrofitting to, and that's standard. And then on the HVAC side, what we found is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, because if you have a really old building with old equipment, there's a great way to upgrade that without having too many negative impacts on the building, right? So you can actually do it while you have a tenant in place. And you see these kind of retrofits happening all the time. So you have, Related has a LEED-only development plan for retrofits and for new construction. At Tishman Speyer in the Rockefeller Center area, they actually did a big retrofit in terms of thermal storage. Durst has a water reclamation program. Vornado, we just raised $450 million earlier this year in green bonds to actually put money back into what we actually think is important in the portfolio. And retrofits, and the Empire State Building is a great example of a full retrofit of an existing building, an old building, but now with new everything, new windows, new HVAC. So the industry is coming a long way, I think, in terms of figuring out how to take what we already have and make it a lot better. And we see a lot of examples of that happening more and more.
And this is happening in both commercial and residential
It
buildings?
is happening in both. Residential's off, they're both tough in different ways, right? The tenants themselves are tough in both ways because you really have to work around people that are living in and working in those spaces. But those are challenges that I think the industry is willing to address because we think this is an important issue. The last piece I think that is worth noting in terms of the change and also what's happening is that we've had city and state level policies that are changing the way that we view these issues. What do I mean by that? Code is changing. So what we retrofit to, the standard itself, has gotten a lot more stringent and is moving the needle in terms of what the baseline is. So it's bringing everybody up at the same time so that we're all building to a better standard. And at the same time, the state is thinking about issues through the Public Service Commission and other incentive-based programs to move the market on issues like cogeneration and backup power so that we're all moving in sync in terms of being able to implement ways to reduce the energy consumption in the city, to address grid issues. And the last thing that I haven't mentioned is kind of superstorm standby and the resiliency piece, which is that all of these things that we've talked about, both in terms of energy efficiency and cogeneration, they all align to make our city more resilient, to be able to deal with the risk that future climate change could bring to the city, and also it helps mitigate the risks, in terms of day-to-day impact, and that's certainly true of commercial and residential. Right. So, there's really been a confluence of events over the last few years that has led us to this place, and I think it's a great opportunity for this administration and for our city to take it one step further with Climate Week and make a statement in terms of New York being a leader on sustainability.
Very interesting. And I want to just ask, as you've encountered resistance, whether it's in office or residential buildings, can you make a case that some of these retrofits and changes also will save money or kind of really improve the bottom line of whether it's tenants residential buildings or tenants of office buildings? Is that something that's part of kind of the pitch to retrofit?
Absolutely, and I think what I said in the beginning about business and environment being completely aligned on this issue, that's exactly the issue, which is that energy efficiency in buildings actually results in lower operating costs for the landlord, but those costs are then being passed on to the tenant, so they're benefiting as well. It's a win-win. The environment wins because we're not using as much energy, and the tenants win and the landlords win because our costs are going down. So I think it's an entire alignment in terms of what we're all trying to achieve.
And is it all under the LEED certification umbrella, kind of these retrofits? Does it all? I mean, I guess I'm curious where that dovetails, like the movement within Rebny and its partners with just the overall LEED certification.
So LEED has been a market-based program. So it's the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and it's been around for 15 years.
Right.
And it really started as a leadership statement in terms of this building is, a green building. We've thought about energy and water and waste and materials and air quality. A really comprehensive label on what the building represented. What has happened in the last 15 years is that LEED has become, at least in the real estate industry in New York, what we think of as best practice, right? It is what the standard is that you should be building to. There are other standards that are emerging. So for existing buildings, one of the things that we do is we benchmark energy consumption so that buildings can compare against each other with something called the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And that's a 0 to 100 scale, 100 being the most efficient, and then buildings fall somewhere in between. Right. The interesting thing about New York is that if the average building is 50, and that should be a nationwide number, New York actually ranks a little bit higher than that. Our average buildings are somewhere in the 60s and 70s because we as a city have been maybe more efficient, have been thinking about these issues a little bit longer, and it's important to us. So there are a couple of metrics that people are kind of falling into, and there are new metrics that are emerging. LEED has been a comprehensive way of looking at a built environment, a building. There are new health-related certifications that are emerging that look at the healthfulness of a space, the materials that are being used, the air quality, the water quality. And those are not just important, I think, in terms of residential and where people live, but also where you work. I mean, we spend 90% of our time indoors.
Right.
So it's a natural progression, I think, from where we've been in terms of thinking about energy, which has a great payback, and you could spend money all day and get a great return, to kind of these comprehensive issues.
Sukanya Paciorek, she's the co-chair of Rebny Sustainability Committee and a vice president at Vornado. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.